Ruth Whitcomb was sitting on her husband's bench at 6:12 on a Monday morning with one of Harold's old work gloves folded in her hands and her lipstick crooked from crying. An orange removal tag hung from the armrest. The city had decided the last thing Harold built was a maintenance problem. I found her there on my morning walk with Bonnie and Lucy. Bonnie saw Ruth first and pulled gently toward the bench. Lucy, who believed grief should be approached with caution and preferably from behind my left shoe, stayed close to my ankle. "Morning, Ruth," I said. Ruth did not look up. She was 81 years old, narrow-shouldered, silver-haired, and usually composed in the way women become when life has asked them to sign too many hospital forms. She touched the orange tag tied to the armrest with plastic wire. "They tagged him, Mike." Not it. Him. That was how I knew this was going to cost me more than a morning. The bench sat under a live oak on the east side of Lake Rowan Park. Harold had built it in 1998, 2 years after his first stroke, when his right hand still shook unless he gave it something useful to do. He had used cypress, stainless bolts, and joinery so stubborn it looked plain until you understood it. Harold used to say a good bench should never announce itself. It should simply be there when your knees had an opinion. Carol loved that bench. During her treatments, when the house felt too full of medicine and cheerful lies, I would drive her to the lake in the late afternoon. We sat on Harold's bench because it caught shade at 4 o'clock, and because Ruth sometimes left peppermints in the little hollow under the armrest. Carol would close her eyes and listen to the water against the bank. "People think benches are for sitting," she once told me. "They are really for staying." That line came back to me while Ruth held Harold's glove. I read the tag, scheduled for removal, standardized replacement pending, safety and maintenance review. There was a phone number at the bottom and the name Derek Halsey, Director of Parks and Recreation. Bonnie sniffed the tag and sneezed, which was more comment than I had managed. "I'll call," I said. Ruth shook her head. They already had a meeting. They said the old benches are inconsistent. That is a strange crime. They said Harold's is sentimental. I looked at the bench, at the wide arms worn smooth by old hands, at the underside where Harold had overbuilt every connection because he did not trust weather, committees, or short screws. "Sentimental things can still be load-bearing," I said. My youngest son Brian arrived that Friday with his 2 boys and a cooler full of groceries he had not packed well. Jack was 16, Charlie 15, both taller than they had been the last time I saw them, and both carrying the mild embarrassment of young men who had not yet decided whether hugging their grandfather was permitted in daylight. Brian was trying. That mattered. He had done damage in his life, some of it to me, some of it to himself. But lately he called before he came over, showed up when he said he would, and listened at least 40% longer before defending himself. For Brian, that was a renovation. "Dad," he said, carrying a watermelon in one arm and a bag of hamburger buns in the other, "the boys can help with whatever you need." Jack looked at his phone. Charlie looked at Bonnie and Lucy. "Do they bite?" Charlie asked. "Only reputations," I said. Brian laughed too quickly, then stopped because he was not sure whether I meant his. That evening, after dinner, I told them about Harold's bench. Brian leaned back in his chair. "Dad, it's a bench. Let the city handle it." I set my fork down. "That is exactly how things disappear," I said. "One reasonable sentence at a time." The kitchen went quiet. Brian looked ashamed, which had not been my intention. Shame makes men either smaller or louder. I had seen Brian become both. I softened my voice. "Come with me in the morning. Bring the boys." At 7 the next morning we met Ruth at the park. Jack was still half asleep. Charlie carried a tape measure like it was evidence in a trial he did not understand. Brian had brought coffee for everybody and only spilled some of it. Ruth stood beside Harold's bench with her purse clutched in front of her. "I don't want to make trouble," she said. "Trouble is already here," I told her. "We are just measuring it." I showed the boys how to inspect wood without insulting it. First you look for rot at the ground line, then you check fasteners, then drainage, then movement. A bench can look old and still be sound. A man can too. Though nobody in city government had asked me. Jack tapped the armrest. "This is just wood, right?" Ruth flinched. Brian opened his mouth, probably to scold him. I stopped him with a look. "Look underneath," I told Jack. He crouched. Charlie crouched beside him. Under the right arm, carved small enough that Harold had not expected applause, were the letters HW plus RW, 1998. Charlie ran a finger near the carving without touching it. Why hide the names underneath? Men Harold's age didn't always need applause, I said. They just wanted the thing to hold. Ruth turned away toward the lake. Brian heard that. I could tell because his face changed the way a wall changes when you find the old framing behind it. We measured every part of the bench. Seat height, back angle, footing spread, bolt diameter. I photographed the underside, the braces, the concrete pads Harold had buried flush with the earth. The center brace was still there, stamped with his initials and the date. Harold had not built a park bench. He had built an argument against being useless. At 10 o'clock, Derek Halsey arrived in a white city SUV. He was mid-40s, neat beard, pressed polo, sunglasses hooked at the collar. He walked like a man who had learned to say no in committee rooms where nobody raised their voice. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "Derek Halsey, I understand there are concerns." "There is an orange tag on a widow's bench," I said. "That tends to create them." His smile was practiced and not unkind. "I understand the attachment, truly. But these benches are part of a standardization project. We are reducing maintenance costs, improving consistency, and lowering liability. By removing benches that are not failing. Age itself is a risk factor." I looked at him. "For benches or people?" Brian shifted behind me. Ruth looked at the ground. Derek's smile thinned by one polite degree. "The review applies to infrastructure." "May I see it? The report?" "If it says Harold's bench is unsafe, I would like to know how." Derek nodded. "Of course. We have a public feedback session scheduled for Tuesday evening. I can make the structural summary available there." Then his voice changed a little. "Last year a woman fell through a picnic table at East Mill Park, broke her hip. The city settled before trial. Since then my boss hears the word wood and sees a lawsuit." That was the first human thing he had said. "I am sorry about the woman," I told him. "So am I. But fear is a poor inspector." That was the moment I knew he thought he had already won. Men who are uncertain offer details. Men who are certain offer meetings. The weekend became busier than Brian expected. I had Jack and Charlie photograph every old bench around the lake. There were 11. Some were plain, some had small brass plaques, some had names carved underneath where only aunts and grandsons would find them. Marvin Lee's bench leaned left, but only because the soil had washed under one side. The bench itself was sound. Edna Price's bench needed 2 bolts. The veteran's bench by the fishing dock had sun-checked boards but no structural failure. Harold's was the strongest of the lot. Brian wanted to carry the heavy things. He always did. Men trying to make up for lost time often confuse volume with usefulness. "Dad, let me handle that," he said, reaching for my tool bag. "Helpful isn't loud, son," I said. "Helpful is accurate." His jaw tightened. For one second I saw the old Brian, the one who heard correction as accusation. Then he swallowed it. Then he handed Charlie the notebook and told Jack to photograph the footing marks before anyone stepped in the dirt. That was better. On Sunday afternoon we set up in my garage. Brian sanded sample boards. Jack labeled photos. Charlie sorted bolts into muffin tins Carol used to use for Christmas candy. Bonnie lay under the workbench like a small foreman. Lucy slept in the doorway, refusing to supervise on weekends. Michelle called while I was checking a footing sketch. "Dad," she said, "Brian says you are organizing a bench investigation. That sounds more dramatic than it is. Are you climbing under city furniture?" "Only the low pieces," she sighed. "You had a heart attack 2 years ago." I remember. I was there. You don't have to save every sad thing. That one landed. Not because she was cruel. Because she loved me and thought worry was a form of wisdom. I looked across the garage at Brian, helping his boys label Harold's photos. No, I said, but sometimes a sad thing is load-bearing. Michelle went quiet. Mom loved that bench, she said finally. She did. I forgot. People forget ordinary places. Do you need me Tuesday? I almost said no. Pride is sneaky at 82. It still wears work boots. Yes, I said. Tuesday evening, the community room at Lake Rowan Park smelled like floor wax and weak coffee. Derek had done his homework. I will give him that. He had a projector, a slide deck, and 2 renderings of sleek aluminum benches with sponsor plaques. He called them durable, modern, accessible, and maintenance-free. He used the phrase community refresh 3 times before I finished my coffee. The old bench builders sat in the second row like men waiting for test results. Marvin Lee had brought his cane. George Bell wore his VFW hat. Ruth sat beside Michelle, Harold's glove folded in her lap. Brian and the boys stood along the back wall. Derek let me speak first. That was generous of him, or meant to look that way. I talked about the benches, about repairability, about cypress and stainless fasteners and drainage. I talked about shade, rest points, and how seniors use those benches as stations on their walks. I did not talk about Carol yet. Some things should not be spent too early. People nodded. Ruth cried without noise. Then Derek stood. I appreciate Mr. Mercer's passion, he said, and I respect what these benches mean to many of you. But sentiment cannot override public safety. There it was. Sentiment. Used like a broom. He clicked to the next slide. We commissioned a professional structural review. On the screen appeared a report with diagrams, photographs, and the kind of seal that makes people sit straighter. It said the benches were non-standard. It said visible aging was present. It said fastener corrosion had been observed. It said uneven slope created fall risk. It recommended removal and standardized replacement. The room changed. Ruth lowered her eyes. Marvin Lee folded his hands over his cane. Brian looked at me like he wanted to interrupt somebody and did not know who. I looked at the screen and felt the floor shift under me. The report was better than I expected. Cleaner. Heavier. It used my language against me. Load, corrosion, slope, liability, risk. For a moment I was not an engineer with an answer. I was an old man with photographs in a folder and a room full of people waiting for me to save something. Derek continued gently. I want to be clear. We are not erasing anyone. We are proposing a memorial plaque on one new bench honoring all previous builders. One new bench for 11 men. That was the neat little box he had brought for our dead. For a minute, I had nothing. That is the honest part. Then my phone buzzed. Jack had sent me a photo from the back wall. No words, just the report image on Derek's screen beside the underside photo Jack had taken Saturday morning. The 2 benches were not the same. The angle was wrong. The brace was wrong. The bolt pattern was wrong. Jack, who had started the weekend thinking benches were just old wood, had seen it before I did. Then I stood. Michelle touched my sleeve once, not to stop me, to steady herself. Mr. Halsey, I said, did your engineer inspect the underside of Harold Whitcomb's bench? The consultant inspected the benches identified in the removal plan, including Harold's. Yes. Then why does his report say the center brace is missing? Derek looked at the screen. I would have to review the document. Please do. He did. The room waited. I put Jack's comparison on the screen. On the left was the consultant's photograph. On the right was Harold's bench, taken by Jack at 8:14 Saturday morning. The center brace was visible, solid and stamped HW 1998. This was taken 3 days ago, I said. By my grandson Jack. Jack stood a little straighter. I clicked to my own slide. Charlie had made it because he understood computers better than I did, and because teenage boys enjoy defeating adults with bullet points. The report photo showed a different bench. The wood species was wrong. The bolt diameter was wrong. The load diagram assumed a freestanding bench, but Harold's was anchored to two buried concrete footings. The corrosion photo was from the fishing dock bench, not Harold's. The consultant had used one generic failure summary for multiple structures. "That doesn't mean the concern is invalid," Derek said. "No," I said. "It means the concern is unmeasured." Then I showed the replacement bench specifications Derek had posted with the meeting packet. The aluminum model had a lower load rating than Harold's bench. It required a concrete pad on grade. On the uneven lakeside slope, that meant excavation, grading, and additional drainage. Its warranty excluded finish damage from heat and standing water. At 3 in the afternoon, a sample aluminum bench near the splash pad measured 142 degrees with an infrared thermometer. Harold's wood bench measured 96. George Bell muttered, "That'll fry a ham." The room laughed, and the laughter broke Derek's rhythm. I put up the cost comparison. Restoring Harold's bench, $184 in materials. Volunteer labor. Replacing it with Derek's bench, concrete pad, and grading. $2,740 before drainage. Derek adjusted his cuffs. Volunteer labor creates its own liability. Michelle stood. "My daughter is a speech pathologist. She can make a room of 7-year-olds stop licking glue. City employees do not frighten her." "My father is sentimental," she said. "He is also almost always right about load-bearing structures." I would listen to both parts. Brian surprised me by stepping forward next. "And if the city needs supervised volunteers, I can coordinate the weekend crews. My sons and I will be there." Jack looked startled. Charlie looked trapped, but neither argued. Ruth rose last. She did not speak loudly. "My husband built that bench after his stroke because he wanted his hands to remember they were still useful. No slide could stand against that." I looked at Derek. "You called them sentimental because you thought sentiment meant soft, but some of the strongest things men build are the things they loved enough to overbuild." Derek did not surrender. Men in pressed polos rarely do in public. He requested a pause for review. He said the city would reevaluate the removal schedule. He said safety remained the top priority, but he did not cut the orange tag off Harold's bench that night. Ruth did. On Saturday, the old men came back with tools, not to fight the city, to restore what was still holding. Marvin Lee brought a socket set older than Derek. George Bell brought sandpaper, a thermos, and 3 opinions about varnish. Brian brought water, folding chairs, and the boys, who had apparently decided history was less boring if it involved power sanders. I assigned tasks. George inspected fasteners. Marvin checked footings. Jack photographed every repair. Charlie wrote down measurements. Brian carried boards, then stopped carrying too many after I looked at him. Ruth sat in the shade and watched Harold's bench become itself again. Bonnie and Lucy stayed leashed to my chair. Bonnie tried to eat a wood shaving. Lucy judged the entire public sector. At noon, Derek arrived. He had no clipboard this time. For a while he stood apart, watching men in their 80s teach teenage boys how to countersink screws and sand with the grain. Then he walked over to me. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "the removal order is suspended pending individual inspection." Individual inspection is usually better than guessing. He took that without flinching. "The city will consider a volunteer restoration program if we can document materials, process, and annual review. I have a checklist." For the first time, he almost smiled for real. "I assumed you might." I handed him 3 copies. He looked at them, then at the bench, then at Ruth. "I thought standardization was fairness," he said quietly. "Sometimes fairness is letting different things remain different for a reason." He nodded once. That was enough. By late afternoon, Harold's bench had new bolts where it needed them, fresh oil in the grain, and the same old shape. We did not sand away the initials underneath. Charlie crawled under and checked. "Still there," he called. Ruth pressed Harold's glove to her mouth. A week later, the city held a dedication that was not called a dedication because Derek still had budgets to defend. The orange tags were gone. In their place were small bronze plaques, discreet and low on the back rail, each with the builder's name and year. Harold's read, "Built by Harold Whitcomb, 1998. Still holding." Ruth traced the words with one finger. Michelle stood beside me. Brian stood with his boys. Jack had put his phone away. Charlie had his hands in his pockets, looking at the bench like it might be more than wood after all. Ruth sat down first. The bench did not creak. That pleased me more than applause would have. Michelle slipped her hand through my arm. Mom really did love this spot, didn't she? She loved anywhere people told the truth without hurrying. Brian heard that too. He looked at the lake, then at his sons. "I thought you were just taking Mom to the park back then," he said. "I was," I said. "I was also taking her somewhere she could be sick without feeling like a patient." Brian's face tightened. He had missed things. So had I. Families are full of late inspections. Jack sat on the far end of Harold's bench. "Grandpa," he said, "how long do you think it'll last now?" I ran my hand over the armrest, over the place Harold's hands had made smooth, and Ruth's grief had kept polished. "Longer if people keep checking underneath." Charlie nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. That evening, after everyone left, I walked Bonnie and Lucy back to the lake. The sunset had turned the water copper. Harold's bench sat under the live oak, not new, not young, not uniform. Better than that. Useful. I sat where Carol used to sit. Bonnie settled under the bench. Lucy leaned against my shoe. Some men leave money. Some leave tools. Some leave sons still trying, grandsons still learning, widows still carrying gloves because the hand that filled them was loved. Harold left a place to sit when your knees hurt and your heart needed a minute. I have seen smaller monuments